Matt Davies, mate, you are the second ever guest on the podcast. How you doing, mate? What's been the story of the week for you so far?
It's been. I've just come back from the school. My daughter's in primary 4, and they had a little carol concert this afternoon, which was very pleasant. So nice and Christmassy. Other than that, we had a busy start to the week at work, but it tails off from now and a fairly quiet week next week. So certainly winding down for Christmas, it feels like, which is very nice.
Not bad, not bad. You must just be happy then in terms of an American football focus that Project Pirate is now underway for you. You were back at work with the guys. How was that for you?
Yeah, really good actually. It was we had an OTA, an organised team activity, on the 3rd of December, so that was already in the diary from the previous head coach, Magoo. So I was chatting to some of the guys that were still on the staff from previously, and we decided, yeah, let's go ahead with it and get everyone back together. Just a chance to kind of knock off the rust and also let the guys on the team see how I run a practice, because every coach has got their own way of doing things and stuff, and that's one of the things I've always really prided myself upon is, running a really tight, organised, high-tempo practice. So we had that. The turn attendance was really good. And the energy was excellent, and the guys worked really hard, and we introduced them to some of the new coaching staff and things. So overall, I was very, very pleased with it, and I think it was a really good start to the kind of to the new regime. Yeah,
And you're carrying on from a guy that was head coach for a while, wasn't he, Andrew McGowan?
he
So
was. Yeah,
what's
he's
the
been the head coach
transition
for the
like?
last few years,
Oh,
and Magoo and I go way back. I mean, I've known him since before I was involved with football. We met at university back in 2003, and I didn't start playing until 2005. So, yeah, me and Magoo go a long, long way back. And when I took over, and even before I took over, I had a couple of long phone calls with him. He was actually on holiday in the States at the time, but we had some long calls and chats about the future and what happened to the last couple of years and stuff and things. So really nice to have his input on it. And he's a great coach and a great guy, and yeah, hopefully he'll be involved again in the team in the future, which would be great.
I was listening to your podcast you did with the Lenko show, was it, very recently?
Yeah,
I did not
indeed.
realise the whole politics of the game here about Edinburgh and things like that, about being able to pay players and rise up. Can you give me a wee bit of an insight on how the game is going in terms of the Scottish game?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, the game's split into several streams up here. So you've got the University League, which runs through the winter. That's taking place just now. And what they did a few years ago was they put all of the Scottish university teams in the same division just to reduce travel, presumably. So you've got Aberdeen, you've got Stirling University, Glasgow University. The University of the West of Scotland team folded at the start of the year, and they've been kind of circling the drain for the last few years. They've always been shorter players and stuff. And then you've got the 3 teams in Edinburgh. So University of Edinburgh, Napier, and Heriot-Watt all have teams, and they're all in the same division, as I say. And what that's done is it's been an interesting challenge, because historically there were always really kind of strong teams up here. Glasgow were kind of the best team for a long time, and then Stirling took over and they started bringing in imports from around Europe and stuff. They had a guy in charge called Rob Orr, and they won a few national championships at Stirling Uni, not in the not too distant past. And then Rob moved on, and they stopped bringing in imports, and they kind of lost the scholarships that the university was offering, and so they really went on a bit of a slide over the last few years. They've just kind of stabilised it now under Danny Smith, the head coach. So that's kind of the university leg. It's there's a bit of a mixed bag there. There's several teams recently have pulled out of games for a lack of players. Some of the facilities that the teams play on are not particularly good. Napier, for example, play at a park that, particularly this time of year, is regularly waterlogged, and so it struggles to get games played, and that's been a bit of a feature for them. But there's still a lot of guys coming into the game up here at university level, which is really good. And Stirling are kind of top of the pile at the moment, with Glasgow just sort of on their heels. And then there's the senior league, which runs through the summer. So you've got the under 16 league, the under 19, and then the adult league. And in terms of that in Scotland, thinking about the senior team, well, let's go for under 16s, under 19s first. So under 16s, you've really got 3 teams. You've got Highland Wildcats, you've got Edinburgh Napier Knights, who are an offshoot of their university team, and then you've got the East Kilbride Pirates, and recently they've added the Paisley Bears, and there's talk of the Glasgow Tigers joining again. They were historically a team, and they haven't been for a long time. I don't know if they're in this year, but they certainly will be in soon. So under 19 feels like it's growing again, which is good. The more kids we can get into the game as early as possible, the more chance we have of producing that really kind of high level talent. And then the under-19 games struggled for the last few years. I was the head coach of the Pirates under-19s from 2016 to 2019. And the year before I took over, there were 4 teams in Scotland. And in the off-season, before I took over, 2 of those teams folded. And that left us with just us, East Kilbride, and the Highland Wildcats. And that was the case for quite a long time until Napier got their under-19 team in. And so that gave us 3 teams in Scotland and a really good standard of football up here as well, which is excellent. I think the hope at some stage is that Glasgow will build their under-16s and develop an under-19 team. We'll see what happens with other teams. But that's kind of where we are at under-19. And then at senior level, you've got a few teams. So the Aberdeen team are kind of struggling these days. I don't know if they'll be back in the league this year. They're supposed to be, but they've struggled with numbers and kind of stability over the last few years. But what they did again was at Division 1, they made an all-Scottish Division 1 the last few years, or the last year, sorry. So that had Aberdeen, had Clyde Valley, and again, they've struggled for stability in numbers. Inverclyde have struggled for numbers. Glasgow have been the kind of the standout team at that level in the Central Belt, and then the Highland Stags, and Highland Stags are by far the best team of that group in Scotland. They've had a really good few years. And then in the Premier Division, which is the division above that, you've got 2 teams, East Kilbride, which is the team I'm now head coach of, and the Enroe Wolves. And historically, as I mentioned on their podcast, the Pirates were top of the pile for, God, I mean, we're talking, 25 plus years, from 1995 when the Glasgow Lions folded and a lot of their players moved to the Pirates. We've been the best team in Scotland all the way through until about 2 or 3 years ago when the Wolves started to kind of creep up and take over from that. So at the moment, they're the best team up here on the field, certainly in the senior league, and our job is to, they're not a major focus of ours, our focus is really internally and getting ourselves in order, but naturally, that's going to be one of the hurdles to overcome, is beating them consistently and moving back up to fighting for playoff spots in the north and competing for national championships. That's where we'd like to get to, so that's kind of a whistle-stop tour of the Scottish game as it stands.
Aye, so you talk about there a lot about youth leagues, university, bringing kids in and really building the standard. How much though of a real challenge is recruitment and player development in a wee country that American football has got nothing on football, even other games like rugby. Basketball is really starting to creep up in the UK now. I just seen Team USA are playing a couple of friendly matches down in London, which is mental, like, to even think about it, like, as a football fan, to think about a national team going to play in another country, which they'll sell the O2 out easily because you'll have your big boys playing. How much of a challenge and how much of a focus as well is put on recruitment and development?
Yeah. So I think the challenge we've always got is getting players in as early as possible is really the dream. The best players I've played alongside have almost always been guys who started the game either at the very beginning of their university time or ideally before that, kind of 15, 16, 17, 18 sort of age. And it is tough because, the 2 big sports up here, particularly football and then rugby, are so well established that getting guys involved in the sport can be tough because you're competing with them and they've got much better resources, much better facilities, all that kind of stuff. And also there are barriers to entry to our sport. It's an expensive sport to take part in. The kit's expensive. So naturally, to run these teams, you have to have a supply of kit to give the kids, and that costs a lot of money. So bringing in grant money and stuff to set teams up is tough. So the recruitment point of view, that's always our focus, is try and get, if you're a team like the Pirates where you've got an internal setup where you've got youth, junior, senior, all within the same organisation, that's really the dream. That's where you want to get to. And then you bring the players in as you fill the funnel from the bottom. You get those guys in as young as possible and you work their way up through the organisation. Up here, Highland Wildcats have got a kind of tie-in now with the Highland Stags, so they're going to have that sort of setup again. We're the only team that's got the full kind of complement all the way through in Scotland. The Tigers, as I mentioned, have just added an under-16 team, but that's not yet established, and they haven't got under-19s. And then the Wolves don't have anything themselves, although they do have Napier in the same city as them, which I know is a useful recruiting tool. But getting players in at that age group is tough, so that's a big focus, and doing school sessions and being visible in that space is really important. At the senior level, it's tough because, particularly if you're playing in the Premier Division, if you do, so we'll have a rookie day on the 14th of January, and we'll get guys along and we'll get them involved and we'll build those guys up. But we know that if you get a guy in who's 18, 19, 20, 25, 30 sometimes, who's got no experience of the sport, it can take quite a long time to get that player up to the level where they are able to be, firstly, safe and secondly, competitive particularly when you're in the Premier Division. If you're in Division 1 or Division 2, it's a little bit easier because the standard's not so high. But when you're in the Premier, getting those guys up to speed it takes a little while. So the players have to be patient as well and recognise they're not going to, get up on the 14th of January and go straight into competitive situations, So that's challenging. But ultimately, that's kind of where my focus has been as a coach, has been around developing players. That has to be absolutely everything we do. We're not in a situation that some of the teams are in. So London teams have always had the advantage that naturally a lot of people who perhaps have played at university or at under 16s, under 19s, then move to London for work. And so there's a natural draw towards that city, which brings talent in. And then if you can get those players involved, they can kind of hit the ground running. We don't really have that up here. You might get some players from, for example, the Highlands move down to the Central Belt for university and you can tap into that pool, but it's certainly not at the same level. So we have to be really conscious of developing the players that we have, of keeping players in the game, who we've brought through under 16, under 19s, and just making sure that there's a real focus on player development. You can't rely on talent just walking through your doors. So we need to spread the word to make sure that we've got access to as many kind of athletes as we can get. And if you can get people who've played another sport, that's often a really good opportunity because they've got the kind of work ethic, they've got the understanding of how being in a team works. They've got maybe they're used to the physicality if they've played something like rugby or ice hockey or lacrosse or something like that, or even kind of martial arts type sports or combat sports can be quite good. So it's just trying to keep as broad a net as you can to bring in the talent, and you never know where you're going to find it.
You have bounced, in terms of your overall roles in the game, you've been involved in the youth levels. You were the linebackers coach, am I right in saying, were you the linebackers coach for the Pirates before, or did you do that for
I was the offensive line
GB?
coach. Yeah, I was the offensive line. So I played for the Pirates from 2006 till 2012, so 7 seasons there.
Aye.
And just before I stepped down, a couple of years before that, I'd started coaching through the winter at Napier University. So I coached offensive line, then 2 years as offensive coordinator. And then when I retired from the Pirates in 2012, I was the offensive line coach 2013, 14, 15. And then I was the head coach of our under 19, 16, 17, 18, 19. So that was the kind of the sort of most successful period of my coaching time. And then after that, I had a bit of time out, and then I got approached to become the assistant head coach of the Great Britain men's national team. So I was the assistant head coach, and I started off coaching tight ends and special teams as well. And then tight ends was passed on to another guy, and I focused on special teams and being the assistant head coach. And I did that up until the end of October. We went away to Denmark to play in Copenhagen against Denmark. And then after that game, I stepped down. And then shortly after that, I applied for and was successful in getting the Pirates head coaching role. So I've worked, and I've also done lots of voluntary stuff, not as a formal coach on a staff, but working with our under 16 team, working with our women's team, lots of different things along the way.
Aye, so are you enjoying then the more broad responsibility that you've now got as the head coach? And I'm assuming that because we're not in the NFL, we don't have general managers, owners, guys that take care of everything. I take it you're in charge of a lot of things.
Yeah, it's definitely broader than it would be in a professional franchise, that's for sure. We've got a fantastic chairman, Amanda. She's been involved with the Pirates since 2007, and she's someone that is a hugely respected and skilled and valuable resource for our organisation. So she takes care of a lot of the stuff, some of the logistical things, getting things booked, organised, planned, all that kind of stuff. And I work with her on those things. I think it's interesting, the head coach role, because I find that coaches who are good coaches in this country tend to have a level at which they excel. So there's positional coaches and there's coordinators and then there's head coaches. I'm not a particularly good coordinator, if I'm honest. The scheme stuff doesn't really interest me that much. And I get it, but I don't get it to the level of some of the great coaches I've worked with. Positionally, I'm a pretty good positional coach at a couple of positions. But the place that I excel is as a head coach. I think setting the agenda for the team, the vision, holding people accountable, managing a staff, motivating people, all that kind of stuff naturally really taps into the stuff that I'm already good at. So for me, when I was a positional coach, I would find myself getting frustrated at some of the things that were being done at the top level staff of the team, and the way that the head coach worked wasn't necessarily in alignment with the way I thought things should be done. When I've been a coordinator, it's been a good learning curve for me, but it's always been quite hard work. It didn't really come easily to me, which is a good reason to do it, to develop myself, but it wasn't something that I found easy. Whereas as a head coach, it just feels really natural. It's something that I find is a really good fit for me. So when this opportunity came up with the Pirates, I think it was a perfect situation. And there's also a couple of things there where, because I coached our under-19s from 2016 till 2019. If you think about our oldest players in that first year would have been 19 in 2016, so they're going to be but 26 now. So the oldest of those players would be 26. The youngest would be 16 in 2019. So they'd be 20 now. So you've got a kind of window of 20 to 26-year-olds, and we had a pretty big squad through those 4 years. So that's quite a lot of young guys in the local area who I have a good connection with. They know what I'm about. They've been coached by me. So from that point of view, in terms of attracting some of those back into the game or coaching the ones who have remained on or at the senior team, that's kind of a nice window for me. And equally, I've just come off the back of a few years coaching with Great Britain, and there's a certain kudos that's attached to that, and that can be appealing to some people. So I think that for me, I'm in a window just now in my life where I'm kind of relevant up here, in a way that maybe 5 years down the line I wouldn't be, 10 years down the line I certainly won't be. So that's why just now it's like a perfect culmination of the right opportunity at the right time for me, and that was why it was a kind of no-brainer to go for it,
Is that whole, what you've described there is what it's all about, being a head coach? Do you think that then derives from your HR background, which you spoke about on Lenko's podcast, and being around
Yeah.
people, and that your job is essentially people?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it's a kind of chicken and egg type thing where, did I move into those types of work and these types of roles in American football because I was good at those things, or did I get good at those things by moving into these? I think it was probably, leadership's something that's always come fairly naturally to me. So it was probably that more so. But yeah, there's a huge overlap between what I do professionally, in terms of exec coaching and team development and facilitating and designing, delivering training, building great teams, helping leaders think about the type of leaders they want to be, setting visions and strategy. All that kind of stuff is a very big part of my kind of professional life. And so they really lend themselves to it, particularly where we are just now in the Pirates. That was another thing actually, is the opportunity came at the right time because of the way the Pirates were. Some of the challenges they've had through the last few years, the specific gaps that they had were the specific skills that I had. I mentioned Magoo before, and he and I are really close, and he's a great coach, but he's got quite a different skill set to me. He's much more, he's a phenomenal defensive coordinator, for example. He's really kind of big into the detail on that stuff. So those are the things that he's really, really good at. Whereas what the team needed just now was that sort of figurehead type role, and that's more like what I'm good at, So it was a perfect storm, really. But there's no doubt that the things that I do professionally help me in my work with the Pirates and with other teams I've coached, and vice versa,
Aye, so you then say about how there's different types of leadership there. You're a different leader to how the guy before you was.
Yeah.
I look at that in an NFL sense. You've got your Bill Belichick's at this end of the spectrum, then you've got your Mike McDaniels at this end. You've got the guy who has the Belichick way, it's his way or the highway.
Yeah.
He can leave, he doesn't care. Then you've got Mike McDaniel, who speaks for himself, doesn't he? He's quite the character. And
Yeah.
whether or not that bleeds out in his style of play is subjective as well. What do you think, though, is the common denominator between these guys? Because one has been at the top for about 20 odd years, and one now looks like he's certainly going to come onto something in his career. What do you think is the common denominator between good coaches, good leaders?
I think what it comes down to is people don't believe the message unless they believe in the messenger. And I think the secret to it is, particularly in that job, in that world, is getting players to believe in you, getting them to believe that you're capable of taking them to the place that they want to go. So if it's in the NFL, they have to believe that this is the head coach who can win us a Super Bowl, who can create an environment where we're hard-working, successful, focused, and deliver against our objectives. And I think that's it. And as you say, there are very different ways to do that. There are the traditional, old school, kind of shouty, military-style head coaches, and some of them have been hugely successful. And then you've got the much more people-centered, kind of like an Andy Reid type character, much more people-focused type guys who equally have been very successful. Bill Belichick's renowned for his attention to detail, and that comes from his dad. Steve, I don't know if you know much about his dad, Steve Belichick. He was a coach himself, and he wrote quite a famous book on, it's called Football Scouting Methods. It's proper old school, actually, but about how you kind of scout football teams live and in person back in the day when getting film was quite hard, and so the attention to detail and the focus on scheme and nuance and that type of stuff is very much his bread and butter. And that's not to suggest that other head coaches don't have that same attention to detail, but that's not what they're famed for. A lot of them are more famed for their personality or their energy or, the way that they kind of craft the team and stuff. So, yeah, and that's one of the things I really love about leadership is there's not one right way. There's lots of different ways that you can lead a team or lead a business or whatever it might be. And you've just got to find, how do I take the natural skills that I have and apply them so that I can be authentic, so that I can be honest, so that I can be myself and become a great leader through that.
Well, you say that, and I look at the last two Miami Dolphins head coaches. I don't know if you can see I dressed for the occasion.
Yeah, I saw that.
So the last guy was a Belichick graduate, and Brian Flores, who turned out to be a bit of a public enemy in the end, to then go on to hire almost his exact opposite in Mike McDaniel. And it seems as if, for example, look at Tagovailoa, he looks like a different, not just in terms of his play, but just up here, he seems a lot more relaxed and comfortable. And I even look at different sports as well. It seems as if times are changing a bit in terms of that guys are a lot more receptive to coaches that are a lot more people-centred. Do you think when doing recruitment and the professional leagues, there is enough done in terms of, the boy can play, but is he going to respond well to my style of coaching? Like, do you think there is enough of, he might be all right with a military coach, or is he going to be all right with me just jumping around and having a bit of a party like Mike McDaniel maybe?
One of the things that those teams do is that, they will speak to the previous coaches of players, at college, at high school, all that kind of stuff. Now, the challenge is there's always an element of smokescreen, because if I'm a college coach of LSU, for example, and you're the team with the number one draft pick, and I've got this quarterback, and I want you to take him as the number one pick because it helps me to sell my school. It's like, look, we've produced the number one pick. If you want to be the number one pick and make loads of money, this is the school to come to. So that's always the challenge, is that a lot of these people have vested interests. But the thing you'll find is, as you get closer to the sport, and I've really noticed this through some friendships I've got of guys in the States. One of my best friends is a coach over there. And despite the fact that, it seems like this huge, big, very glamorous world, college and NFL coaching, it's a very small world. And those guys all know each other incredibly well. There's this really tangled web of this guy coached at this high school and played against this guy, and then they coached against each other at college, and then they ended up on the same staff at the NFL. And it's remarkable how well they all know each other. So I think they're pretty good generally of getting that sort of honest assessment of players. But the thing that's always fascinating to me is there's so many variables as to whether a team will be successful, and the coaching style and approach, I think, is a big part of it, but it is only one part of it, You see these players who were phenomenal at college and just never really pan out in the pros. That could be because, they lose the work ethic. They think, like, I've already achieved the goal, which is to get to the NFL. Now I can take my foot off the gas. You get some players who are brought into a scheme which doesn't really suit the style of play that they were kind of successful under. Some players are really good at a certain thing, but actually they're only good at that thing, and when you try and broaden their skill set, it doesn't really work. So there's loads of different things that play into it, but I do think that there is definitely a focus on that recruitment aspect, and those teams reaching out to those players before they draft them, or pick them up in free agency, and really having that conversation. And that's why I think being honest and authentic is really, really important, because you have to be able to make a connection with somebody if you're going to coach them. And that's why even when we're recruiting guys for the Pirates, I am very clear about the type of coach I am and the type of experience that players will have, And I think there are lots of coaches out there who'll promise you the moon on a stick just to get you to come and play for them. But then you end up coming along and realise that it's not actually like that, and that just ends up with players becoming frustrated and disenfranchised and things. I'd rather be really honest up front. And if that honesty means that players think, actually, that's not the place for me, that's okay, because we're not wasting each other's time then, So I think there's definitely a bit of that with coaches being really clear about what is my style, what is my approach, what are my expectations, and that then allows people to opt in and opt out accordingly to their preferences.
it's interesting. Then you say about being honest and no wasting somebody's time who comes in for an interview or for a tryout. How easy then do you think it is to get sucked into this guy could be the star quarterback in the league and he's come up here and you're thinking, right, we need him. If he's no agreeing with you, if he's not quite the character you want, how easy is it to maybe get sucked into but we need to have him? And you see that a lot in sports. You see guys with attitude, so you just think that's a recipe for disaster. And it happens.
Yeah. I think one of the things that drives that is that there are a lot of coaches, not just in our sport in the UK, but all around the world in all sports, whose egos are very closely linked to their success on the league table, you know. And I'm very lucky in that mine isn't. You know, I will not, when I am, and I say this to people all the time, when I am dead and gone, my win-loss record will not be going on my gravestone. You know, like that's not what I'll be remembered for. And so for me, that makes it a lot easier. And when we have players who are challenging, who are potentially troublemakers, I have no problem having that conversation with them and making it clear that actually this probably isn't the place for you. And I had that under 19s. You know, we had a few players along the time that, you know, just proved to be incredibly difficult and a real distraction. And they made other people's lives at the team miserable. And I just had the conversation and got rid of them, which for an under 19 team might seem harsh, but, you know, it's like, am I doing the right thing by this one player, but am I doing the right thing by these 50 players if I keep them around, you know? So I think that stuff's really important, but it is something that you see all the time. People will tolerate, and it's not just in sports, but in business, people will tolerate behaviors that are dysfunctional if the individual's performance enhances the overall team or business or whatever it might be. You know, quarterbacks are a perfect example in the NFL. You know, a lot of them, like the Michael Vick situation, a lot of the stuff that he was doing was kind of known about and it was sort of tolerated because he was tearing it up. But ultimately, those things always come back to haunt you. There aren't many examples of players where there hasn't been some blow up somewhere down the line. And it's just like, you know, how desperate are you to win and how willing are you to kind of be in the middle of that when it happens?
I seen something as well, I think it was a few weeks ago when I was doing a bit of preparation for this, it just popped up and I thought I'll have to ask you about it, and it was Tom Brady had said that he doesn't believe the standard of quarterback is the same as when he was playing, and my first Super Bowl was Super Bowl 50, so I was at the tail end of the guys that he was playing with, and whether or not I agree with them, give me another few years and I'll agree with that. And you talk about the wanting to win, the drive to win. First, do you agree with him? But then second, do you think that has dwindled out a wee bit? Do you think even in the space of about 20 years, we went from guys like Roethlisberger and the Manning brothers to guys who are taking hissy fits because they're not getting paid enough?
I think there's definitely a change in expectations for sure. And I think one of the things that's really going to drive that is the situation at college football now with the NIL money. You know, that's something I was thinking about this week actually in my downtime. I was reflecting on it out for a walk. So for people who are listening who don't know about this, college players who are the players who ultimately get drafted to play in the NFL, they've never been paid. They've never been allowed to be paid. Now, there's been plenty of examples where they have been paid under the table. Reggie Bush had his Heisman Trophy taken off him. You know, the SMU Mustangs are a really famous example from back in the day. But it's never been legitimate that it happens. But over the last few years, there was this sort of backlash that built and built and built, where it's like these players make hundreds of millions of dollars for their universities, and they go out there and they have, you know, play a very physical, very dangerous sport, and they get nothing for it. You know, why? How is that fair that they enrich the university and yet they get nothing? And so they've changed the situation where universities are now allowed to bring in money that can then be allocated to players via, you know, image and naming rights and likenesses and all that kind of stuff. And so what that's going to mean is that some of the really high-end college players will end up making more money at college than they would actually make in terms of salaries when they get to the NFL. And I do wonder if there will come a point where, especially with the challenges around concussions and the longevity of some of these players and what their lives are like after football, I wonder if we'll get to a situation where some players, really high-end players, will succeed at college, make an awful lot of money and decide they don't want to go pro. They're not willing to put their body through that for another, 3, 4, 5, 10 years for some of them. So I think that's going to be really interesting. I do think there's a change in terms of players' expectations, though. I think just in terms of back in the day feeling like, it was okay for coaches to just shout at players and go nuts and things. I don't think that's so well tolerated. And there's the tendency for some people to brand younger players nowadays as snowflakes and as being soft and stuff. But I think there's a difference between that and just not tolerated being treated like shit, to be honest. And so I think there's something in that. But players are always different from generation to generation, and it's always easy for a guy like Tom Brady to look back, with this kind of rose-tinted specs of the players that you mentioned, because there have been some phenomenal quarterbacks over the years that he was in the league, but there were also some terrible ones. There were plenty of poor quarterbacks, and the fact that he played for such a long time at such a high level means there were even more terrible quarterbacks coming and going at teams like. I mean, think of some of the teams like the Jets and the Browns and a lot of those teams, Cleveland and Cincinnati, a lot of those teams had terrible quarterbacks during that period. And there were some great ones for sure, but I wouldn't say it's like a wholesale drop off. But I do think there are changes in the league that have affected it, and one of the things that's actually having an impact, I think, is the quality of offensive line play. Because you can have the best quarterback in the world, but if they're on the ground for the majority of the game, they're not going to be able to make much of an impact. And they've changed the rules around the amount of contact time that players are allowed to have and the amount of physicality in practices. And what that's certainly doing is impacting the quality of offensive line play, and that naturally makes the quarterbacks look worse. And I'm not saying it's all down to offensive line, because that's the position I played, the position I'm most passionate about. But I think because it's such a systemic sport, if you've got a world-class quarterbacks, but you've got receivers with bricks for hands, then, they're going to have loads of drops, loads of incompletions. They're going to look bad on the stat line. If you've got a world-class quarterback and a terrible offensive line, they're going to spend the whole game running for their life or lying on the ground. So there's lots of other things that play into it. And I think it's easy for guys like Tom Brady to look back with rose-tinted specs. But I'm sure we could sit here and go through the archives and pull out 20 names of terrible quarterbacks that played when he played.
And you talk about expectations, even just financially there, but also the actual style of play of quarterback has changed completely now. If you can't run, so would Tom Brady have even been drafted at all in today's NFL is the question.
Absolutely.
And we even look at that across sports in general. Basketball, big men are expected to shoot now. Goalkeepers in football are expected to have the ball at their feet. So, because he came really from the last era of quarterbacks when it was all right to sit in the pocket, and that was your game. So, I also then want to talk about Belichick again, because I believe it's come out that there's been an agreement that he's going to leave at the end of the season, because it's just the way it's all panned out.
Well, yeah.
I think it was after the game in Germany they were saying. I'm not discrediting anything he did. Of course I'm not. On paper, statistically, should he be renowned as the greatest ever? Maybe. But at the same time, as soon as Tom Brady legged that franchise went into freefall, do you think he is starting to become a wee bit of a Brady carried him for a couple of decades? From a coach's perspective, though,
there's always going to be those conversations, but it's also worth remembering that in the early years when they were winning Super Bowls, they were doing it with pretty terrible offensive performances, but a world-class defense. And it's worth remembering that Bill Belichick had won 2 Super Bowls with the Giants as defensive coordinator before he even went to the Patriots, And that they had Jeff Hostetler at quarterback for one of them and Phil Simms for the other one. It wasn't like they had these absolute world-class quarterbacks in those days. So I think his success in the early days showed how capable he was at winning even when they didn't have phenomenal offensive output. And it just so happened that through his own diligence and hard work and through some great coaching, not necessarily by Belichick, but by some of the offensive guys they brought in, Brady turned into being, one of the best players of any position in any sport of all time. And I think that certainly helps. But I don't think... you also, again, you look at the great offensive lines he had. He had some phenomenal players for those seasons where they were really successful. And you think, would a different coach have been able to draft and bring in those players? Because his draft in the last few years has been patchy. But one of the things that Belichick was always very good at was building up draft picks. Making really smart trades and bringing in guys who not necessarily bringing in their talent through the draft, but bringing it in through the back door in free agency, and then using that to stockpile draft picks to then trade for other things. He was phenomenal at that, and they put together some absolutely incredible teams, and those offensive lines again, make him look good. Would he have been as successful if he hadn't had guys like, Wes Welker and Julian Edelman and Randy Moss? He had some phenomenal talent at receiver over the years. So it's never that's the thing I love about the game, is it's never a one-man game. But there's no doubt that the two of them are a phenomenal combination, It's like to have those two guys together, it's like lightning striking twice, and I don't think you can discount the contribution that Belichick made to Brady's success, and I certainly don't think you can discount the contribution that Brady made to Belichick's.
Yeah, and we then do talk about the changes in the game, the expectations of players. Are you somebody that does constantly see new trends going on or new ways to do things? Because the NFL is getting a trickier league. Year after year, there's more ways to play. Like, I mean, even look at the Dolphins, for example. They're playing high-flying, gunslinging, Tyreek Hill-centred football. Are you somebody that does buy into new developments? Are you somebody that's always looking for new things to do? And then what do you think of people that don't adapt and change, maybe like in the way Belichick, because everybody's seen he's a bit washed these days, I think it's the way to use him.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think I'm always looking for new ideas, new developments. But what I would say is, particularly as it pertains to the British game, there's a tendency for a lot of coaches to watch something on Sunday and think, we need that play, the Philly special, we need that play in, you know what I mean? And they go to practice on Wednesday and install it. And I think things work contextually. Like those plays where Tyreek Hill blows the top off the coverage and, Tua just absolutely rakes the ball, 60 yards through the air. Those are great, but you show me a quarterback and receiver combination in Great Britain that could do that. You've got to be realistic about the personnel you have. And the truth is, and I've spoken about this before, that I've been watching games in the UK since 2005, so that's a pretty kind of chunky amount of football I've watched over here, both live and on, recorded things and, on a lot of the streams that we have nowadays. And I've only really seen a handful of games in that time where scheme has been the determining factor. More often than not, it comes down to who can block better and who can tackle better. And that's why I'm a big believer that while all these innovations in terms of scheme are fascinating and they're always great to stay on top of and think about how could we incorporate some of these things to enhance what we do, I'm much more focused on fundamentals. I'm much more focused on having a team that are solid fundamentally, that tackle well, that block well, that are fit and healthy and strong, that are explosive, that play at a good tempo. And if you do those things, you'll win more often than you lose. A great example over here is the London Warriors, who they've lost the last two national championships to the Manchester Titans, but before that they were a bit of a powerhouse. So they've been to God knows how many national championships in a row now, and won a big chunk of them. And they had very simple offensive and defensive schemes. They only ran a handful of plays on offense and they only ran, a couple of coverages on defense, but they beat teams to death because they were so well drilled, so disciplined, great athletes. And I think that's really the focus. Ultimately, when all of the playing fields are leveled, when you get to the NFL where everyone's a wicked athlete, then you've got to find those little nuances that can help you separate yourself. But over here, the place we're at as a sport, it's really going to come down to who's got the better athletes and who's got the better fundamentals.
Yeah, I think even just the way that learning about sports is becoming a wee bit too detailed, because I get a lot of tweets. So say Arsenal have played on the Sunday and it'll be like how Mikel Arteta broke down Eddie Howe's press and all that, and then it will show you all your kind of highlights of Martinelli came here, blah blah blah.
Yeah.
And then you look at so many young managers as well and so many young coaches thinking, right, Mikel Arteta did that for Arsenal, I'm going to try and teach my Sunday League players how to do it.
Yeah.
Do you think there needs to just be a wee bit more of a focus on those fundamentals, like you're saying, and less about? And as much as I love reading those things, I do, because I love watching the game and thinking, right, this is what's going on. But do you think we look at that stuff too much in today's game, and do you think we need to go backwards a wee bit?
I think what happens is there's so many media outlets nowadays. Historically you would have your newspapers and you'd have your radio and you'd have your TV, and that was it. But nowadays there are hundreds and thousands of online outlets, and they're all looking for a way to differentiate themselves. So breaking down statistics or breaking down schemes and stuff becomes a thing, and there is a danger that people become obsessed with it. But you've always got to remember that when Mikel Arteta was breaking teams down, he was doing it with a bunch of full-time professionals and a whole host of full-time professional staff in data and analytics and, film analysis and stuff. And so the things that he's able to do are over and above the things that we're able to do as amateur sportsmen or Sunday league football teams, whatever. They practice once a week and then play a game on a Sunday or whatever it might be. So you've always got to be realistic about what you can achieve in the time you had. And I think that's why my focus is always on fundamentals, because if you can't pass the ball effectively and tackle and shoot and, get back into position and track back and press and do those things well, then it doesn't matter if you've got this phenomenal, diamond formation in the centre of the field, or if you're running a 4-4-2. It's like the same thing applies. You need to be fundamentally sound, otherwise the scheme isn't really going to save you. So there's always a balance for sure, and I think it's important to be constantly learning from these teams. And sometimes you'll see something you're like, that's actually how we could swap these players around, because the physical attributes would lend themselves more to what this team is doing actually, now that I think about it, or switch these guys around, or just play with more width or whatever it might be, because we've got the speed to kind of cover. I think those types of things are always good to be learning from. But yeah, I do think that people can get themselves really carried away. And scheme's exciting and it's sexy. Scheme and breaking down film and all that stuff. That's the sexy stuff. Running 40 minutes of tackling drills isn't sexy, so people would rather not do it. And I think that's the danger. You need to remind yourself that sometimes it's not the sexy stuff that's going to make you successful. It's just being consistent and doing the basics well.
Then as well, we're talking about literally training once, maybe twice a week, and not being professional, and that you can put a lot more into the fundamentals. Do you think that gives you a bit of an advantage as a coach, in the sense that you've got a set of guys who are just passionate about the game and they do know their basics and they're just playing it because they just want to play it? Does that give you an advantage as a coach? Does it make your life a wee bit easier?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's definitely a lot to be said for it. Don't get me wrong, I'd love more contact time with our guys. I'd love better facilities for the team, of course, and we're always looking to build those. But I think ultimately the fact that you've got this group of guys who have chosen to be there, they've actively chosen to be in this situation, part of this sport, playing for this team. That's a huge thing. And because of that, that brings with it a certain level of effort. And you'll always get players on any team that are coasting, the ones that, particularly if you've got a successful team. So Manchester Titans is a great example. They've naturally drawn towards themselves really talented players that want to be competing at the top level, but naturally they've also drawn towards themselves guys who just want to hang on the coattails of those players and win a national championship and look good doing it and get some photos for Instagram and look the part. So you're always going to have a little bit of that. But I think there's definitely something about our sport that really drives a passion and an engagement from the point of view that they've all opted to be there and they're all paying to be there as well.
And then I want to maybe speed up a wee bit. I'm conscious of your time, of course. We're about 40 odd minutes in, so we're doing all right. We've still got a wee bit of time. I want to talk about this. Is it the European League that's going on?
Yeah.
It was quite literally that Lenko show which made me aware of that. I hadn't seen it at all. I went online, looked it up, and I thought, this format looks really that's quite good. It's quite professional looking. Do you think that is something that should Britain get a wee bit more involved in? Should it become a bit more like a Champions League? Do you think that is something that is going to be very crucial to, not even just in this country, but continental wise?
Yeah, so the interesting thing with the European League of Football is historically there were leagues around the Europe where you could play sort of semi-pro football. You could go to Germany or you could go to France or Austria. They were the big leagues historically. And you could get paid to go over there and play for the summer if you were a really talented player. And one of the great things that the ELF has done is that it's opened that up. It's created more franchises because it's kind of you've got those national leagues, then you've got this European-wide league. You've created more opportunities for players to be paid. Now, I think that's a great thing, because I think if you're young and you don't have things tying you down, you don't have maybe a mortgage or a kind of proper grown up job or a family and kids and stuff, and you've got the flexibility to go and live in another country and play football for the summer and get paid for your troubles. I mean, none of these guys are making, retirement money, but they're making enough to tide them over and a little bit to spend on the side. And I think it's an amazing experience, amazing cultural opportunity as well. And the guys that I know have done it on the whole have really enjoyed it. So it's really good from that point of view to increase the opportunities for people to do that. On the flip side, however, quite a few of these teams have had financial problems over the last year or so. There have been teams folded, teams where just guys haven't got paid. They've just kind of pulled people's contracts and sent everyone home and stuff. And so there's definitely some teething issues with it, that's for sure. In terms of Britain's involvement, I think one of the things I would say is, I think the cost to have a franchise, just to enter the ELF, is something like £250,000.
Gee.
And that's just to enter. That doesn't actually cover the cost of running the team, bringing in the imports, travelling all these games across Europe. The costs are absolutely astronomical. And so typically these teams are bankrolled by somebody. They've got an owner who's, or they've brought in funding of some kind. And it's kind of a passion project, I think, for a lot of people out there. So we have to be realistic about that. There was talk a couple of years ago, of the London Warriors entering, but I know from speaking to their head coach Tony Allen at a coaches convention a couple of years ago, he was saying, the costs are just astronomical. There are other European leagues, kind of almost Champions League style ones, and I know the Manchester Titans are going to be playing in Europe this year, which will be a really great experience for them. But equally, I know that the Bristol Aztecs are going to play a friendly over in Amsterdam against the Crusaders. So teams are finding ways to get involved with those types of things. I do think it's great. I think anything that grows the sport and creates opportunities and lets our young guys go out there is a really good thing. That being said, I mean, I mentioned this on Lenny's podcast. There's also the challenge that when you're trying to get players involved in a national program like we were at GB, sometimes it's like, actually I would come and play for the national program, but A, it costs a fortune. B, it's quite a time commitment, and C, if I get injured doing something that I'm paying for, it might affect my ability to get paid work playing out in Germany or Austria or wherever each of these teams are, Istanbul. I mean, there's teams all over the place. So it's definitely having an impact on some of those things. But that's not to say I think it's a negative. I do think it's a great thing to grow the sport.
I want to then quickly talk about your own business that you've got. You were in the banking industry before, if I'm not wrong.
I was, yeah. I spent 15 years in RBS, which is now NatWest.
Yeah, not bad. You now then have transitioned into being a sole trader. It's your own business now. I can't imagine they were paying you too badly in the bank. So how does one really factor in all the risks? And it's not as if you're selling a physical product as well. You're very much client-based, it's service-based. How do you weigh everything up in your head and think, let's do it? Why not?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's something I'd always had an aspiration to do for maybe the last sort of 5 years before I did it, something like that. And I'd been put at risk previously twice in the bank, put at risk of redundancy, and both those times I'd stayed in the bank and found another job. But this final time it happened, I'd come to the stage where the package I was going to get, the financial package for taking redundancy, was pretty good. It was going to tide me over for, I think in the end, it tided me over for about, I paid off some kind of credit card debt and put some money away in my savings, bought myself that bass guitar there, and then I kind of had money that would tide me over for about 8 or 9 months, so that I kind of had my income covered. And so that gave me a bit of a runway, which is a really good thing from the point of view of mitigating risk. If I'd had to come out and make cover my living expenses from day one, I think it would have been very difficult. So there's definitely the risk is, because I'm financially quite conservative, really. I'm pretty kind of careful and try and plan and save for the future. And so there was an element of risk, but that gave me a runway to kind of build from. And also, I was confident in my own skills as well. I was confident in the skills and the capability I had. And equally, one of the things, again, that I touched on Lenny's podcast is I'm very good at building a network. It's not something I necessarily think about a lot. It's just kind of the way I'm built, is meeting people, making connections, finding ways to be helpful to them, and then somewhere down the line that being reciprocated, all that kind of stuff. That just comes really, really naturally to me. So I was confident that I would be able to build a network and get something going. I didn't know if I would replace my salary, certainly not in the early stages, but I was very lucky that, a few good opportunities came my way, and, I left in September and I'd replaced my salary by the January. So that money that I had kind of tided me over, I was able to, instead of paying myself, build up my money inside the bank, inside the business, which meant that, down the line, if things did dry up a little bit, I still had a bit in the tank to keep me going. So, it was kind of just almost building that stability that you have in the bank out on your own, which is it's not easy, but it's very rewarding because it's all you.
I'm doing marketing at uni, and I always like to think about you're not selling the product, you're selling the experience, so you're selling what the product can do for you. I
Absolutely.
always think with something like a coaching business, leadership just sounds like something that's very, not universal, but it's, why would you pay money for it? So as opposed to asking you why are you selling leadership, I want to ask, what within that do you think you're selling with your business in?
You heading off?
Well, no, but Jim.
Or do you want my iPad? This is what having a little person's all about these days. They come through to see you.
A wee cameo.
You get through there. It's a great question, and you're absolutely right. And I think it's one of those things that lots of people think they can do. People think they can do it internally, or they think they can do it as leaders. One of the things that, say, exec coaching offers is a safe space to just talk things over. It's amazing how many. I had a message yesterday from an old client that I used to work with when I was in the bank. And that person reached out and said, I'm going through this difficult time at work. I'd really appreciate a couple of sessions. Are you free to do that? And I was like, yeah, actually, I could do one tonight if you wanted. We put one in later on in the evening. And giving people a safe space to talk things through. It's amazing how often, particularly in exec coaching, like I'm not there to solve the client's problems. I'm just there to give them a safe space and kind of hold that space for them to talk it out and come to their own solutions. But it's amazing how helpful people find that, just to step away from the environment they're in and have that. So that's a big thing. I think also with a lot of the stuff I do, like facilitating or emceeing events, whatever, sometimes leaders like to actually be part of the event rather than being at the head of the table. So when you come in as an external person, you can do that. I think some of the training stuff that I do gives people a chance to really, you can kind of prick their conscience. You can get them thinking differently about leadership. We spoke at the start of this podcast about different styles of leadership, and I think different things that you can offer to leaders to think about the type of leader that they are, the type of leader that they want to be, the impact that's having, those sorts of things. Leaders find it super, super valuable. And there are also a lot of reluctant leaders out there. There are people who have ended up in leadership positions, not through choice, just through, a kind of fluke of recruitment and selection and promotion and all those types of things. So I think anything you can do to help those leaders out and help them really become great leaders doesn't just help them, but it helps the people that they lead and the outcomes that those people generate. So yeah, I think there's a lot of things in there that are really valuable. And equally, I think for a lot of people who've never experienced something like coaching, I would totally recommend people just try it. Find a coach you like. I had I had a chemistry call this morning with a guy as a potential coaching client. And I've got another one tomorrow actually with another guy, just talking about how they look, kind of see if there's a kind of vibe there. That's really all it is like, could I work with this person? And I think go out and try that, find a coach, and kind of take some challenges to them and talk them over. And yeah, I think there's a lot to be said for it. It's something that everybody I've worked with has found value in it, and I think it's one of those. It's kind of like people when they get into mindfulness or meditation stuff. It's like you don't really know what it is until you try it, but when you try it, you might find it useful, you might find it not, but it's worth giving a go.
I want to then finish off then just with a wee question, because I've been trying to think everybody seems to finish off their podcast in some fancy way. I didn't get that innovative, but you're a coach, both business-wise, you're a coach American football-wise, you've got a family, you've got a career, you like your guitars there. And say, what for you then in your life is short, medium and long-term success?
You've just disappeared. You had done the big build-up, and then the question never emerged. You froze.
Oh, All right,
Cool.
right,
Hit me
right.
with, hit
So,
me with a question.
for you, short, medium, and long term, what's success for you?
Yeah. Success for me long term is you met Harper there very briefly, is being the best dad I can
Aye.
be for her. And that means providing for the family. That means, being the kind of role model that, she can look up to, being the right kind of support, but also challenging her, helping her develop herself, helping her build the skills and capabilities and traits that she'll need, through the rest of her life. So that's number one. I think, equally alongside that has been a great husband. That's got to be a focus. It's very easy to just let your relationships kind of slide and just coast through them. So those are kind of the fundamental ones. Business wise, I think stabilizing what I do and looking to pick up some bigger contracts and deliver those contracts by bringing in some of my peers to kind of work not for me but alongside me on some of those things. So I've started that this year a little bit, but that's something I really want to push on to and have, and work with bigger organizations on my own. I think that would be good. Football wise, I think if I can sit down at the end of each year and look back and see that I've had a positive impact of the lives of the players and the coaches that I work with, and I've left the organisation in a better place than it was at the start of that year, that to me is success. I would love to be, 5 years from now sitting with 3 national championship rings. That'd be a lovely thing, right? Everybody likes winning. Everybody would rather win than lose. But that's not how I measure my success. I measure it by the impact I have on people and by the way they develop and the things that they're able to achieve, both on the field and in their lives outside of football. And if I can look back, if I can look myself in the mirror and say, you've done that, then that'll be success for me, and leave the Pirates in a great place so that when I do eventually step down, whenever that is, the next person who steps in is picking up something that's in great shape. Because, in 2 years' time, we'll have our 40th anniversary of the Pirates. We were founded in 1985. So it's a big time for us, and I want to make sure that we've got another 40 great years ahead of us.
Well, Matt, you've made my job very easy today, I must say. You've been an absolute pleasure to talk to. Thanks very much. Like we said, you weren't the first man on the podcast, but the first American football man. We'll give you that.
There we go. And
That's your
listen, thanks
title.
for having me on. It's been real lovely chatting.
Thanks very much, mate.